Um, Sanibonani Mahlabe Zulu. I welcome you all to today's lecture. Today we are discussing a historic event in our history as Matebele people, as Mtwagazi. We are discussing about the Battle of Shangani. I'm sure you've read in white in Eurocentric history books, history literature around us. They want to belittle it and say it was a Shangani patrol. But however, its proper name is the Battle of Shangani. Right, as we proceed here, and for simple analysis, we are going to have this lecture in three strands of knowledge. We are going to look at a historical perspective based on the series of events. When I say the series of events, I mean the war itself, the episodes of war, and other related battles. This is the first strand that we are going to look at it. Another analysis is based on the political perspective. The political perspective, we're looking at the political structure of Matebeleland at that particular time. And we also want to understand how did the political events of that particular time affect decision making and strategies in that war. And on the third event, on the third perspective, we are going to look at the economic side, the consequences of the war. How much did we lose in terms of wealth? Also in terms of the value that we had at that particular time vis-a-vis the forecast that we can be having at this point in moment. Right, now let's look at the first strand, the historical perspective, a series of events and a series of battles that led to the battle of Pupu, where they call it the Shangani patrol. I've also explained why would the European historian or Eurocentric historians try to, as much as possible, to belittle or to give to treat it as a small incident. Right. And that war was between the British South Africa Company and the Matebele. The war started. It started in modern day battlefields, where we had two regiments of the British South Africa Company. When we had two regiments of the British South Africa Company, that was the Victoria segment and the Salisbury column. They gathered in what is today Kwekwe battlefields, and they made a strategic reconnaissance. Now they advanced into Matebeleland. The first battle was in Iron Hill Mine. Right, prior to the war, the king had decided to reinforce the eastern border, which we call the Jameson Line, and in that process the king had deployed a regiment, one of our crack regiments in Sugamini, which was led by Manondwana Chabalala. So that regiment was simply placed there to reinforce the border, given the incidents of cattle that were being stolen by the whites, both by the whites and by the neighboring Mashona people, which I will, for convenience of history, I will call them the Karanga people at that particular time. I will not call them the Shona, because there was, at that particular time, no one was known as a Shona until 1933. So the term Shona is a recent historical construction. Well, we can call that the Shona identity were formed by the British, by the Rhodesian government in 1933. But anyway, that's besides the point. But the most interesting thing that they fought in Iron Hill Mine. Insugamini was led by Manondwana, and other regiments like Uchingeni, Enga, they also assisted Insugamini. That in that battle it was stalemate. Fine, the Europeans could not be stopped, but the Matebele were not defeated. So the thing that Insugamini did, they allowed the pioneer column to proceed, but under strict monitoring and surveillance. Now, because the pioneer column knew the Ndebele tactics, they decided to rest or to sleep during day and travel by night. Right, that was a strategy trying to minimize surprise attacks by the Ndebeles. But they really knew, when Adal Mison writes in his memos, he says that you could think everything was peaceful, but we knew that there was lurking danger right in the forest, right behind us. Any moment could have been turned into something. But they proceeded, and then they were stopped again, in another battle again, by Insugamini at what is called the Shangani battle. We should not confuse it with the Pupu battle. Shangani battle, Shangani is a very long river that starts in most parts of Matebele in the north right up to the Zambezi. So it was in the Shangani battle that they were stopped. Again in that battle, it was a stalemate. The pioneer columns were allowed. The pioneer column was allowed once more to move and advance much closer to Bulawayo. Now, events in Bulawayo, the king called for a full war council. Now, he needed to reinforce his frontline men. Now, the king brought in more regiments to try and stop the advancing pioneer column. Those regiments were the Imbizo, the Craig regiment, which was led by, first it was under Mkhululi, Halimana Mkhululi, and then Mchana Jojo, Mchana Kumalo took over the command of Imbizo. And then there was also Bulawayo, which was led by Magwegwe Fuyana, Ingubo by Fusikanye, and quite a number of regiments, but I've just named 3 for the convenience. So in the war council there, the king advised that the pioneer column should not be attacked unless and until they attempt to cross Umguza River. Now, I'm sure if you know the geography surrounding Bulawayo, you will agree with me that Bulawayo is surrounded by Umguza River. That was a strategic point. Now, the pioneer column advanced. Remember, my lecture is based on the Battle of Pupu. However, there are quite important incidences that we must understand on what happened in what today is called the Battle of Mbembesi or the Battle of Gadad. Now, when the pioneer column advanced, they decided to rest at a place where they will not be caught unaware. And that place now is a historic site of a decisive battle that marked the end of our kingdom. Right. I will cite Alan Wilson in his memos. He says that the last thing that they attacked, that they expected at that particular time, remember it was 12 afternoon, 12 p.m. He says that the last thing that they expected was a Matebele attack. They deliberately stayed at that particular position, a place which is a semi-desert, no trees, nothing. Now, they deliberately stayed there. When they were staying there, they deliberately rested there. They took everything. They started to repair. They even unleashed their horses. But Alan Wilson writes that they saw 3 senior Matebele indunas having a meeting. Right, I will name those indunas. Alan Wilson says it was Manondwana Chabalala of Insugamini, Mchana Kumalo of Imbizo, and Makwekwe Fuyane of Bulawayo. Now, in terms of seniority, in the absence of the king, Makwekwe Fuyane was senior than Manondwane and Mchana. Now, in terms of experience, Manondwana Chabalala had the experience of the war. In more than 3 occasions, he had faced the European Maxim Khan and avoided a decisive defeat. Remember, he fought them at Iron Hill Mine. He also fought them at Shangani. Now, it was his 3rd episode. And as Alan Wilson writes in his memoirs, he says that they expected Makwekwe Fuyane to lead the war, the battle. If not, it was not Makwekwe, it was supposed to be Manondwana. However, they were quite surprised when they saw Mchana Kumalo assuming the command and the leadership. Well, as it proceeds, he also says that they were further surprised when they heard a Matebele war cry signaling the beginning of the attack. He said that they could not believe their luck. They rushed to the Maxim Gun, and within less than an hour, they had slayed down many Matebele warriors. But however, before he concludes, Alan Wilson says that there was a problem in Matebeleland. It had nothing to do with the war or anything. 3 months before, King Lopengula had survived an attack on his life. So you understand that there is a political dimension to the strategies that were employed at Gadad. However, let's quickly proceed to the battle of Pupu. Now, they attacked, Imbizo attacked the pioneer column at Gadad in broad daylight, which is quite contrast with the Matebele attack system. Remember, the Matebele or Umtwagazi used to attack either early in the morning or late at night. Now, they attacked in broad daylight. They did not take the instruction of the king to attack the pioneer column when they were crossing Umkuza River. Now, they were allowed to proceed. Now, they had defeated one of our crack regiments in Bizo, and they proceeded. Upon hearing the news, King Leopengula left Bulawayo and went further north. Now, there is, it is not clear from historical contents who was really responsible for burning down the kraal of the king, or the capital of today. So, when the king left, there were quite some issues, quite a number of things that were there. I will explain them when we look at the economic context of the war and the consequences of the war. But when the Europeans arrived in Bulawayo, they could not find the king, much to their disappointment. Now, they decided now to make a quick follow-up on the king. Right, the war was fought in 3 fronts. I will also have to touch another quite related incident. You must remember that the war was fought from the front of modern-day Maswengo, which was Fort Vitoli. Now they met at Battlefields and they fought with the Salisbury column. Now, another column which was coming from Botswana, which was Bechuanaland by then, which was led by Captain Gold Adams. Lobengula had sent Campus Tole to go and try to stop that contingent from advancing into Bulawayo. Campus Tole did not take Lobengula's instruction. Instead, he allowed the Pioneer column to advance further, the Bechuanaland column to advance further into Bulawayo. Now, when they settled in Bulawayo, 3 columns were there, one from Bechuanaland, one from Fort Vitoli, and the other one from Salisbury. Now they could not find the king. The king had escaped and went further north. Now they set a mission to be on his trails. Right? They organized an army of 320 men. In that army, remember, when the war started, there were 6, I think the moderate number is from 652 to 700 soldiers, European soldiers. They were assisted by about 700 Shona Batmen, and this is between the Salisbury column and the Fort Victoria column. Now the Bechuanaland column had also a contingent of Tswana men that were drafted into the regiments, into the army that had came to attack us. But when they met in Bulawayo, they decided to further follow the king up north. The king had left some days before. Now they followed him up a certain section that was led by Alan Wilson. Now, the king had crossed Shangani River to a place that we'll call Pupu, the place of the battle. So in that place there, the pioneer column decided to cross the Shangani River and follow the king and capture the king. Now, 38 men. We are not so sure about the numbers of their batmen. We will then suggest that it could have been 3 or 4 times more than the European contingent. They crossed the river. Now, upon crossing the river, they went to a site and they suspected that the king could have been in the surrounding areas. Alan Wilson is said to have shouted at the name of the king and asked the king to come and surrender. Now, to his surprise, there was no response from the king, nor the king's contingent, but they heard a Matebele war cry. Now, as they write now in their European books, they say that in that particular battle, the Alan Wilson patrol group, it killed a lot of Matebele, which is not possible. Right. Events were quite different now. If you know the geography and the environment of Matebele North, you will agree with me. The place around there is a thick forest. Now, it provided cover for the Matebele warriors. But besides that, it started raining. And they say our own historical accounts tell us that Inkosi yahambe izulu lisina. It means that when it started raining, the king disappeared. Now, there is an interesting narration to that. The claim is that the Shangani River swelled up, which is true. But I grew up in that area. I know that area very well. Shangani River doesn't swell up around this time. It doesn't take a day's rain to flood the Shangani River. It takes weeks and probably months. the right time for the Shangani River to flood is between the last week, the first and the second week of January, the last week of December, or the first and the second week of January. That's when the Shangani River gets flooded. But then, at that particular day, which is the 5th of December, the Shangani River was flooded. Now, one interesting narration is that King Lopengula had rain-making powers. Now, what could have flooded the river could not have been the rains of that particular day. In our own culture, we call it amalipo, gombe imlingo. Those are extra-natural powers that flooded that particular river. Now, the pioneer column could not cross back. It only, according to historical accounts, only 2 American scouts. However, their fate is unknown. They escaped across the river, but we don't get enough evidence to understand whether they managed to swim across the river, or they were killed before crossing the river, or they were swept away by the river. So the rest remained. The fight started as expected. Now, because of the cover and the rains, the Maxim gun was ineffective. They could not fire as much as they could, as they had done at Mbembesi, at Kadadi. Now, as they write in their own accounts, they also say the accuracy of the shooting of the regiments had drastically improved. So the whole contingent, they were walloped. They were killed in a traditional Matebele slaughtering style. Before they die, their stomach is ripped up open. So there was quite a number of weapons were found there. Upon the end of the war, when the weapons were collected, there were a number of weapons. Some of the weapons included the Tonga type of spears that were also used in that particular battle, which actually show a lot of diversity among the ethnic group of the people who took to the war there. So the bodies of those whites, the remains of the pioneer column, were not discovered until a man which was called James Dawson. You know, James Dawson used to be the manager of Lopengula's mines. So James Dawson was the one who discovered them, and they collected their remains. I'm sure about 6 months later, they took them to Masvingo, to Great Zimbabwe, to bury them first. For the reason why they took them, those men, it came from Great Zimbabwe. They buried them there, and after some time, I think after the death of Cicely John Ross, they exhumed them and they reburied them in Matopos. I'm sure close to Cicely John Ross. Now, when they failed to capture the king proceeded further north. In our own historical knowledge, we know, of course, with the passage of time, the king eventually died. But we will not say that. We say the king disappeared. So the king disappeared at that particular day. The last time when the king was seen was on the 5th of December 1893. And the king disappeared. Now, there is a question now that is quite contemporary and topical. The question is, who really led the battle at Pupu? I will emphasize this. During the course of last week, I'm sure it's last week, yes, the government of Zimbabwe recognized Chana Khumalo for his contribution on the back at that particular battle, the Battle of Pupu, and they made him a very big hero. That response or that assertion by the government, we would like to challenge it. It's irrelevant, untrue, and quite misleading. It doesn't reflect the historical context. Right? Why I am saying so is because historical evidence suggests that Mchana's regiments were defeated. Right? Mchana was defeated at a place today that we called the Battle of Mbembezi. Imbizo was wiped out. Now, we don't hear much about Mchana Khumalo after the Battle of Mbembezi. And it is quite unlikely that he was the main commander at the Battle of Pupu. It is quite unlikely, right? For the reason that I have already said, his own regiment was defeated and walloped. He had no regiment to command, and besides that, there was a senior chief there, far much more senior than him, Makwekwe Fuyane, and there was an experienced fighter who had fought the Pioneer Column more than 3 times without losing against them, Manondwana Chabalala of Insugamini. Now, this is the point that we have to emphasize in this particular time, that it is quite unlikely that Mchana Khumalo, it is untrue that Mchana Khumalo led that particular battle. So the recognition of him as a commander at Pupu is quite misleading. It really needs a further historical content and further historical evidence. Now, we will look at the events then. Now, as we move quickly forward to analyze all these events that are related to, you will remember that in 1896, in what was erroneously called, or in what it is erroneously called the First Chimurenga. Trust me, there is nothing called the First Chimurenga. It is the Second Matebele War. Right, in that war, the Matebele were led by Lozke Idlodlo, Queen Lozke Idlodlo, the principal wife of King Lopengula, and other Indunas. In particular reference, we have no history or no record of Mchana Khumalo taking part in that war. Remember, I also explained about that the king instructed Campus Tole to go and block the advancing pioneer column from Bechuanaland. He didn't do that. And in that particular war, in the Second Matebele War, we have no history that Campus Tole took. He participated. However, when there was a truce, Campus Tole sided with the Europeans. So this is the story. I'm just making this reference in the context of the recognition of Mchana Khumalo, which was made by the Zimbabwean government in the course of last week. We have no history of, the last time we hear about Mchana Khumalo was the Battle of Mbembezi, which the king's orders were deliberately not followed up. So this is the last time we hear about him. There is no way that he could have taken over the charge at Pupu, and we have no history of him partaking in the Second Matebele War, despite the fact that he lived until 1906. So I hope all these things at one particular time we'll have a time to correct them. Now, this is the historical context, the perspectives of the war. Now, let's move to the second strand of this lecture. Let's look at the political side and the consequences of that particular war. Right, you might recall that Earlier on, I indicated that there was an attempt in Lopengula's wife, in King Lopengula's life, 3 months before the war. Now, after the demise of the kingdom, we as a people, we lost our sovereignty, meaning that we ceased to be a nation. We went under a transition of colonialism. It lasted 90 years in Mashonaland, and it lasted 87 years in Matebeleland. Now, when we finally fought against the colonialists, and when we were given our independence, we were not recognized as a state that existed before colonialism. Now, we have got to understand the consequence of this event. I will cite for you United Nations Colonial Committee Statute, which I will refer as the decolonial process policy of 1960. I'm sure you can Google it right now and find it. Right? It says that any colony that was colonized should be returned to its former state upon independence. Now, the events of the Lancaster House in 1980 did not recognize Matebeleland as an independent state before colonialism. And therefore, we were placed under a colonial system of a sister colony that we will call now Mashonaland. And you will remember that if you take the Lancaster House document, it will tell you that by 1980, Mashonaland were given 66, and Matebeleland was allocated 20 parliamentary seats, despite the fact that in terms of geography, Matebeleland is bigger than Mashonaland. You must also know that in the context of the Zimbabwean geography, there is nothing called Midlands. All the part of Midlands today that you guys call Midlands, it is actually Matebeleland. So, by that, the flawed decolonization process has put our people under a modern or a proxy of colonialism. That is, in this case, the Zimbabwean government, because I say this because by the time of colonization, the end of colonization, we were supposed to be given back our country the way that it was taken by the colonial period. And then it was up to us to decide if we wanted to join Zimbabwe, as the case of Matebeleland in Zambia, we could have made our own decision, but we're not informed. We're simply taken from another colonial system and placed in another colonial system. So this is a political consequence. Now, as we proceed, let's also look at the economic consequence of the war. Remember, I told you that when the king left Bulawayo, there was a lot of treasure, wealth, in terms of diamonds and gold. That the expected value of those diamonds and gold were 10 million sovereign pounds. Right, a sovereign pound is double the commoner's pound. By 1893 standard, 10 million sovereign pounds will simply translate to 20 million commoner's pound. If you factor that, and then you will look at the net present value streams, try to bring it into modern day value, how much money do you think we can have as a nation? I'm sure we will all go back home, and then we will also be able to raise our own nation to modern day economies, developed economy and so forth, because there is a lot of money there. Right. Those are the things that we can claim as part of our reparations. Now, besides the wealth in terms of diamonds, we had a lot of cattle. Right? A number of cattle. Remember, upon defeating Lopengula, the colonialists, they formed what is called a loot committee. Right? That loot committee was simply responsible for looting our wealth. Right? They distributed the cattle. Some of them were taken to South Africa. Some of them were taken to New Zealand. Some of them were taken to Australia. Some were kept at Naunesi in a ranch. I'm sure Naunesi ranch is around Mwenezi. Between Mwenezi, Rutenga, somewhere around Chiretsi there. That's where the other cattle were kept. Well, some of the cattle were given to the European pioneers and the Shona Batmen. I'm sure I have a record of a telegram that was coming from Martin to Gray, giving the exact number of cattle, how they were distributed per province to European settlers, per province to Shona settlers, and the other ones were taken to Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. So it is quite recorded. It's not a hearsay or it's not a folklore. It is a historical fact. Right. You also know that Thomas Mkhululi and other European guys got a lot of our cattle, and that was the money that they used to capitalize their business. Today, Thomas Mkhululi is one of the biggest hotels around Africa. They are listed in Johannesburg, they are listed in London, they are listed in New York, they are listed in Beijing. So you will then understand the value of our wealth, of our father's wealth, in modern day terms. Right, that's an economics perspective. But quite interesting. Also, from a humanitarian perspective, the results of the war had severe consequences that they are still felt by now. Remember, when the king was defeated, the advancing pioneer column committed genocide. They raped women, they killed a lot of men, and they created in what is today called reserves. I'm sure you know the reserves of 1894. If you know very well that if you come from Cholocho, you come from Kwai, areas of Lupane and so forth, all those places were not habited by people because of mosquitoes and because of tsetse flies. So as a result, when the Matebele our people were moved away from productive areas and productive fertile lands, soils, they moved and they were grouped in Cholocho, in Kwai, in what they called Kwai Shangani reserves. So for a long period of time, people were being moved and put into those reserves. The whole idea there was to expose people to malaria so that they will die in numbers. I will also tell you one thing that you probably might not know. Before colonialism, the population of Matebeleland was 3 times bigger than the population of Mashonaland. It's a historical fact. But if you look today at our numbers, how minority we are, you are really, really surprised. What really happened during the years of colonialism? I've given you the explanation. It is a series of genocides and a series where labor was imported. It was imported from freed slaves in Fort Jesus that were taken and placed into into places in Mashonaland for farming areas and purposes. So you must understand that those guys were they were never delayed, they were never disadvantaged by genocides. They kept on multiplying and reproducing to a point where they become a vast majority as it is today. So now, in a nutshell, to conclude this lecture, we will revisit 3 important points. Remember, our lecture was based on 3 strands of knowledge. Now, the first strand of knowledge was the political side, political perspective that I've given. We lost our nation, we lost our nationhood after we were defeated by the pioneer column, And later on, upon independence, we were also placed another sister colony, which we call Mashonaland, and up to today, we an occupied state. Right, that's a political perspective. And from a humanitarian perspective, the consequences of the war were quite severe. We lost a lot of people through genocide. Our women were raped. We were displaced into malaria-infested regions like Cholocho and Lupane. I'm sure you all have also indicated that. From an economic perspective, you also remember that I spoke very much tentatively about the wealth that we had. We had a lot of wealth, more than 10 million worth of gold and diamonds in sovereign pounds. Our own kekli were taken. They were taken to New Zealand. They were taken to Australia. They were taken to South Africa. Some of them were given to Europeans that they used to start businesses today that are multi-billion businesses. But we have got no share, and we have never made a legal claim to those things. I'm sure we should be in a position, with this knowledge that we have, we should be in a position to claim all those reparations. I mean, it should not stop us. As we speak right today, the British are paying for the Herero in Namibia. Sorry, the Germans are paying for the Herero in Namibia. The British are still paying the Machi Machi in Tanzania. And they are also still paying in Kenya. The Germans are still paying the Jews. What is stopping us from claiming our reparations? We should claim our reparations. We should claim the reparations in terms of the wealth that we lost, in terms of humanitarian losses that we incurred. So, as we conclude this lecture, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who has taken his appointed time to come and listen to the historical lecture that I have given. I will also emphasize that the Berkeley of Pupu is a Berkeley that belongs to the legends of history. Right. The British Army was defeated outside Britain only 2 times in their history. Right. The first one, they were defeated by the Zulus at Esandlwana, the Battle of Esandlwana. The British were defeated by the Zulus. Now, in that battle, it was before the invention of the Maxim gun. So the Zulus used their sheer power and their numbers to surround the Europeans, the British in particular, and kill them. Now, the second battle that they were defeated outside Europe, they were defeated by the Matebele in 1893. Thus, only 2 times the British were defeated outside Europe. They were defeated by the Matebele in 1893. So with this recognition, today we celebrate the hero of our forefathers. We glorify their names. We pray and we wish that the identity of Matebele nation will be encouraged and resurrected by the heroes today that stopped a machine gun, that fought gallantly at Pupu, and defeated the European forces. Remember, the only time when the Maxim gun was used against an African army was only in Matebeleland and in Ghana against the Asante. So that was the only time. And the Asante did not record a single battle against the Europeans, against the Maxim gun. But we did record a battle. And also again in 1896. in that war, well, it is outside our scope. I hope one time, at one particular time, we'll get time to explain the events of 1896 that I have called the Second Matebele War, which is erroneously called Chimurenga. I challenge that. It is the Second Matebele War. So I hope one time we'll get time to discuss about that war. But in that war again, we were never defeated. In fact, because the war was taking long and the pioneer colon could not sustain the war, Cecily John Rhodes took it upon himself to go to Matopos and make a negotiation. Most of the things that were negotiated and agreed there, they were never implemented. So we never lost that war. So you could understand that as we stand today, despite having gone through series of colonialism, first colonialism by the British, and the second colonialism by our settler, our black brothers from Zimbabwe. They've also colonized us, but we remain proud. We remain hopeful that at some particular time in future, our children will be encouraged by the heroism that has been continuously established by our forefathers. Right. With these short words, I would like to thank you, everyone. I would like to thank you, 1893 Umtwakazi Human Rights Group, for giving us this time to come and meet and discuss about this important battle. I hope we will continue to engage after this lesson has been closed. In other platforms or in this platform, we can still talk about it. We will meet in other threads in social media, in Facebook, in WhatsApp. We will discuss about this battle in length and in detail. Thank you very much for taking your time to come and listen to this lecture. I thank you. Goodbye.